Hello.
Assalamualaikum, ma'am.
Walaikum salam. Walaikum salam.
Assalamualaikum, ma'am.
So, how are you?
Fine, Alhamdulillah, ma'am. How are you,
I'm
ma'am?
fine. Alhamdulillah. So, I will go to our lecture first. So, in my last class, I was talking about the. I just finished embryonic period, that is 4 to 8 week. So we have seen how an embryo is formed, how the two-dimensional embryonic disc becomes three-dimensional cylindrical structure. So we have finished that thing. Now, what I usually do this time, due to Corona pandemic, the situation is different. I just go system by system, one after another. After fourth week, I start the digestive system, then the cardiovascular, and so on. And this pharyngeal apparatus, I go uh, lastly. So this time, as you are going through your head neck card, and I couldn't take the classes in the first few months because of my family issues. So I'm taking the pharyngeal apparatus. Today I will start this because you will understand. But there may be, I think there may be some lackings because you haven't gone through the digestive tube. But I will try my level best to make you understand. You just go on listening and see the slides and follow the pictures. I will jump. Here are so many pictures and so many slides. I will jump. The ones which are necessary for you, I'll just discuss or go through that one. So we will start the pharyngeal apparatus. Apparatus means, consists of some structures with similar function, like you have gone through the biliary apparatus. So biliary apparatus means that the structures which form bile and secrete the bile to the intestine, like the liver cell, biliary canaliculi, right and left hepatic duct, common hepatic duct, cystic duct, bile duct, then hepatopancreatic ampulla and into the duodenum. So this is biliary apparatus. Now we will go to the pharyngeal apparatus so you can understand. I will discuss some structures which will develop, which will give rise to some structures in a region like your head, like your neck, head and neck region of the human being, or head and neck region. The pharyngeal apparatus structure will give rise to the structures of the head and neck region. So I will go to the next slide. I will just finish. This is just, I will go through very fast. The head and neck region of a 4-week human embryo somewhat resemble these regions of a fish embryo of a comparable stage of development. It's somewhat like fish embryo, so you don't have to write it. And this explains the former use of the designation branchial apparatus. Formerly, we call it branchial apparatus, not the pharyngeal, because it looks like the embryo of fish initially, like fish embryo. That is why we call it branchial apparatus. Branchia means gill, or gill, whatever you say, which fish have. Many of you who have gone through your biology, you know what is that. By the end of embryonic period, these structures have either become rearranged and adapted to new functions or disappeared. So I don't go to this. Now, pharyngeal apparatus consists of pharyngeal arches, pharyngeal pouches, and pharyngeal cleft. This is important for you. What are the apparatus? What are the structures which comprise the pharyngeal apparatus? Number one, pharyngeal arches, which is mesodermal. Number two, pharyngeal pouches, which is endodermal. And number three, pharyngeal grooves or clefts, which is ectodermal. And there is another thing, it is written in some book or it is not written in some book, you can mention or you may not mention, that is pharyngeal membranes. So pharyngeal membranes like the buccopharyngeal membrane, I told you this membrane, the buccopharyngeal and the cloacal membrane, here only there is ectoderm and endoderm, no mesoderm is here. It forms a membrane. Membrane means a porda or a curtain. So this membrane separates something from something, and this membrane is composed of ectoderm and endoderm, no intervening mesoderm. So what are the structures which form pharyngeal apparatus? Pharyngeal arches, which is mesodermal, pharyngeal pouches, which is endodermal, and pharyngeal grooves or clefts, which is ectodermal, and there is also pharyngeal membranes, which is consisted of ectoderm and endoderm. So I will show you a figure here. So this is an embryo during the end of 4th week. So here, look, these are the somites. I told you about the somites. These are the somites. And in the neck region, this is the head region, there are some arches. Look at the arch. This is an arch, 1, 2, and 3. These are the pharyngeal arches. And here, the tissue present in these arches are mesoderm. Etir bhitore mesoderm thake. So here lie mesoderm. And interestingly, these mesoderm come from neural crest. এই mesoderm gula neural crest থেকে আসে. So, and in between the pharyngeal arches, there is a groove here, here, and also here. So these grooves or clefts are ectodermal. Between the arches. So these are the pharyngeal grooves or clefts. They are ectodermal. And also inside here, there will be pharyngeal tube, which is a part of digestive tube. Digestive tube is at a part. And that from the digestive tube or pharyngeal tube, there will be outpouching like here, like here, like here, which is endodermal, and that is pharyngeal pouches. So if you understand this figure, look here, these 3 are pharyngeal arches, এই যে 3টা. So এখানে ভিতরে mesoderm আছে, and in between the 2 arch, এখানে ectoderm আছে. So these are the pharyngeal clefts or grooves. And also here lie the pharyngeal tube, which is a part of gut tube. And there is outpouching of the pharyngeal gut like these, and these are endodermal. And here lie a membrane, the buccopharyngeal membrane, which is only the ectoderm and endoderm are in close apposition, no mesoderm intervene. So we have seen this. So the pharyngeal apparatus, these embryonic structures, the pharyngeal arches, pouches, and clefts, they contribute to the formation of the head, face, and neck region of the embryo. Head, face region, and neck. Head, neck, and face. And most of the congenital anomalies in these regions originate during transformation of these pharyngeal apparatus into its adult. We will see what are the adult structures which will be derived from these pharyngeal apparatus. So during this transformation of the pharyngeal arches, pouches, and clefts, if there is any problem or anything goes astray or there is deviation, there will be some anomalies. So, the pharyngeal apparatus begin to develop early in the 4th week as the neural crest cells migrate into the future. So I told you that in the pharyngeal apparatus, the neural crest cells migrate and stay there. Now, the first pair of pharyngeal arches, the primordium of the jaw, appears as surface elevations lateral to the developing pharynx. So the first pair of pharyngeal arches, the primordium of the jaw, appears on the surface as surface elevation like, and other regions, pharyngeal arches So by the end of 4th week, 4 pairs of pharyngeal arches are visible externally. You remember this. So we know what is pharyngeal arch. There are arches in the neck region. Mesoderm is there. And by the end of 4th week, there will be 4 pairs of pharyngeal arches. Look here, embryo, end of 4th week. First pair of pharyngeal arches here, ekhane. And this is the second pharyngeal arch. And this is the third pharyngeal arch. And here is the fourth pharyngeal arch. And here is the pharyngeal groove or cleft between two pharyngeal arch. Ejector arch. Here is the pharyngeal cleft or groove. So this is the figure. The 5th and 6th arches are rudimentary and are not visible on the surface of the embryo. The 5th pair disappear. So they are altogether pharyngeal arches 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. 5th pair disappear. So we will get first pharyngeal arch, second pharyngeal arch, third pharyngeal arch, fourth pharyngeal arch, and 6th pharyngeal arch. The 5th pharyngeal arch usually disappear. Remember, the 5th pharyngeal arch usually disappear. So we will get 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. And the pharyngeal arches are separated from each other by fissures or grooves or clefts, which are known as the pharyngeal grooves or clefts. So each pharyngeal arch will be separated from one another by cleft or groove. They give rise to pharyngeal grooves or clefts. So here again, see this figure. This is number 1 pharyngeal arch, number 2, number 3. Here come in a later stage of development, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and there will be number 6 here, but 5th will disappear. And in between each pharyngeal arch, like here, is pharyngeal groove or cleft. Here, pharyngeal groove or cleft. Here, pharyngeal groove or cleft. Here, here, here. So they are ectodermal. And inside these pharyngeal arches, there is mesoderm. And mostly this mesoderm, the cells come from neural crest. Like the pharyngeal arches, the clefts or grooves are numbered also in a craniofacial sequence, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like this. Now, the first pharyngeal arch, which is also known as, these are important, remember, the first pharyngeal arch, also known as mandibular arch. The first pharyngeal arch, also known, we will ask you, or it will come in the exam. How many pharyngeal arches are there, madam? 5. What are those? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. What about the 5th? The 5th pair usually disappear. So the first pharyngeal arch, I'm talking about the first pharyngeal arch now. The first pharyngeal arch, also known as mandibular arch, and it has 2 prominences. Number 1 is the maxillary prominence, and number 2 is the mandibular prominence. So the first pharyngeal arch is also known as the mandibular arch. Look here, mandibular arch. And the first pharyngeal arch is divided into 2 prominence. That is, one arch has 2 prominence. Number 1, maxillary prominence, and number 2, mandibular prominence. Maxillary and mandibular. So I'm coming here. So here lie the first pharyngeal arch here. Look here, ekhane. So this is mandibular prominence, and this part is maxillary prominence. So the first pharyngeal arch is known as the mandibular arch. And this first pharyngeal arch, which is known as mandibular arch, it is divided into 2, the mandibular prominence and maxillary prominence, like here. And here is our buccopharyngeal membrane. And this deep ditch is known as stomodium. I already told you, stomodium is ectodermal. Ekhane stomodium, ei jagata. So this is stomodium and this is ectodermal. Here is our mandibular arch or first pharyngeal arch. Now, I will go to above. The maxillary prominence will give rise to maxilla, zygomatic bone, the mesoderm of the maxillary prominence. The mesoderm of the maxillary prominence will give rise to your maxilla, your zygomatic bone, and the squamous part of the temporal bone. If you can, I cannot show you because I'm not in the class. Just think about your own face and you just touch your maxilla and go to your zygomatic bone and go to the temporal part of your squamous part of your temporal bone. So this part of your face comes from the squamous part of the temporal bone, come from the maxillary prominence. Then this maxillary prominence here, it will give rise to your maxilla, your zygomatic bone, and your squamous part of temporal bone. And the mandibular prominence will give rise to the mandible. So here is our mouth. This is stomodium. Here is buccopharyngeal membrane. Ekhane ache upper jaw, that is maxilla is upper jaw, zygomatic bone and squamous part of temporal bone, and here is our mandible. So these bones are derived from mesoderm of the first pharyngeal arch or the mesoderm of the mandibular arch. So look this figure. আচ্ছা এটা আমি পরে আসছি. So mandibular prominence from the lower jaw. So this is the mandibular prominence, and from your lower jaw, just forget about the other things. And here the maxillary prominence will lie here and will give rise to your maxilla here, zygomatic bone here, squamous part of the temporal bone here. So upper jaw. Our mandible will be formed by mandibular prominence, but these bones, they all are derived from the first pharyngeal arch, that is the mandibular arch. Consequently, the first pair of pharyngeal arches plays a major role in the facial development. So now you can understand that first pharyngeal arch have a very good or big role in the development of your facial bones, maxilla, zygomatic bone, squamous part of temporal bone, and mandible. So this is important. Now come to the second pharyngeal arch. The second pharyngeal arch is also known as the hyoid arch. Contributes to the formation of hyoid bone. If you know about the hyoid bone in the middle of your neck, this is a very small bone but very important bone. Very small but very important bone. So the second pharyngeal arch gives rise to part of the hyoid bone, not the whole hyoid bone, part of the hyoid bone. So the second pharyngeal arch is known as the hyoid arch. Come here. So the second pharyngeal arch, this one is the second pharyngeal arch, the blue one. So look, this black one is the hyoid bone, and hyoid bone has a body, and also it has a lesser horn above and a greater horn, this one below. So this upper part of the body of the hyoid bone and the lesser horn of the hyoid bone comes from the second pharyngeal arch. That is why it is known as hyoid arch. Look here, this is a schematic representation of the arches: first arch, second arch, third arch, fourth arch, fifth arch, sixth arch, and fifth is not there. So how many pharyngeal arches? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. Different color. It is red, blue, yellow, red again, and green. So this picture has been taken from Langman. So the first pharyngeal arch, I told that I haven't shown here the maxillary prominence. This is a part of the first pharyngeal arch, jeta kina tomar maxilla, hyoid bone, and squamous part of temporal bone. And mandibular prominence gives rise to the mandible. The second pharyngeal arch, blue in color here, also known as the hyoid arch, it gives rise to hyoid bone and lesser horn of hyoid bone. So the first pair of pharyngeal, okay, the second pharyngeal arch and hyoid bone. The pharyngeal arches support the lateral walls of the and the primordial mouth or stomodium initially appears a slight depression on the surface of ectoderm. I just told you what is stomodium. Stomodium is this part. যখন এই আর্চগুলো হবে swelling, here is a depression. So a depression type stomodium, this is ectodermal. This will give rise to our oral cavity. Next, the stomodium is separated from the cavity of the pharynx by bilaminar membrane. Bilaminar means 2 layers, the oropharyngeal or buccopharyngeal, I told you. and just here lie the buccopharyngeal membrane. এখানে এই জায়গাটায় buccopharyngeal membrane, and here lie the pharyngeal tube. And during 26th day, this buccopharyngeal membrane will tear or disappear, and the pharyngeal or gut tube will communicate with the amniotic cavity here. এটা ঠিক আছে, এটা বাদ, এখন আর লাগবে না। এটা লাগবে না, not now. Now, each pharyngeal arch consists of a core of mesenchyme or mesoderm, একই কথা, and is covered externally by ectoderm and internally by endoderm. This is like this. যে pharyngeal arch, এই যে এটা একটা pharyngeal arch, হ্যাঁ, এটা বাইরে আছে ectoderm, ভিতরে endoderm, and মাঝখানে একটা membrane. ওকে, ফিনিশ ইট, এটা দরকার নাই, এগুলোরও দরকার নাই এখন, no need of these things now. Too much হয়ে গেছে। Now, the fate of the pharyngeal arches. The pharyngeal arches contribute extensively to the formation of face, nasal cavities, larynx, mouth, pharynx, and neck. During 5th week, the second pharyngeal arch enlarges and overgrows the third and fourth arches. Now I'm coming to typical pharyngeal arch contains. A pharyngeal arch has a cartilaginous rod that forms the bones of the face and neck region of the embryo. Like I told you, the maxillary prominence will give rise to maxilla, hyoid bone, and squamous part of temporal bone. I told you the mandibular prominence will give rise to mandible, that is the lower jaw and upper jaw. The hyoid arch will give rise to part of the hyoid bone, that is the upper part of the body, and the lesser horn of the hyoid bone. So this much I have told you. And the third pharyngeal arch will give rise to rest of the body of the hyoid bone and greater horn of hyoid bone. And fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch, cartilage of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch will give rise to cartilages of larynx. Except epiglottis. So you have, I think you have gone through larynx. So you know in the larynx, what is this? Larynx is the windpipe and continuous with the trachea. So larynx has some cartilages, some are paired cartilages, some are unpaired cartilages. So laryngeal cartilages come from fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches except the epiglottis. So if you remember this figure, you can remember the bones which come from the pharyngeal arches, because I told you pharyngeal arches contain mesoderm. এর ভিতরে mesoderm আছে অথবা mesenchyme আছে. Those mesoderm or mesenchyme, some of which have migrated from neural crest. Okay, finish. So mesoderm has a cartilaginous component. প্রত্যেকটা আর্চের মধ্যে একটা করে cartilage থাকে. So that cartilaginous component will give rise to bones of your face and your neck region. Like the first pharyngeal arch or mandibular arch have two prominences. This is exception. অন্যগুলার এরকম নাই, যার যেটা একটা একটা, যেরকম first pharyngeal arch or mandibular arch has a maxillary prominence and a mandibular prominence. Maxillary prominence will give rise to maxilla, zygomatic bone, and here is the squamous part of hyoid bone. Mandibular prominence will give rise to the mandible. Also, there are three small bones inside your ear. Your teacher will teach you later on. Just go on listening this from me, that the ear, which is the organ of hearing and equilibrium, কানটা, তার ভিতরে তিনটে ছোট ছোট middle ear cavityতে there are three small pieces of bony ossicles, malleus, incus, and stapes. Malleus, incus, and stapes. So this malleus and incus will come from mandibular arch. cartilage of mandibular arch. Now come to second pharyngeal arch. It is known as hyoid arch. It will give rise to upper part of the body of the hyoid bone, lesser horn of hyoid bone, styloid process of the temporal bone, and the stapes. This is a bony ossicle of middle ear cavity. Third pharyngeal arch will give rise to rest of the body of the hyoid bone and greater horn of hyoid bone. And fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch will give rise to the cartilages of our larynx except epiglottis. So if you remember this figure, if you get the mone rakhle, or if you can draw, then you can remember or you can memorize the derivatives of the cartilages of the pharyngeal arches, or what are the bones derived from pharyngeal arches. Now, a typical pharyngeal arch has a cartilaginous component which gives rise to the bones. A typical pharyngeal arch has a muscular component which come from the myotome of the somatomere and gives rise to the skeletal muscles in the head, face, and neck region of the embryo. So, a pharyngeal arch has a cartilaginous component which gives rise to the bones of the face and neck region. A typical pharyngeal arch has a muscular component which gives rise to the skeletal muscles in the head, face, and neck region of the embryo. Head, face, and neck region. Now, a typical pharyngeal arch has a nerve that supplies the mucosa and muscles derived from the arch. So every pharyngeal arch has its own nerve. Each pharyngeal arch has its own nerve. Like the first pharyngeal arch, the nerve is the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. And what is the function of the nerve? To supply, motor supply, to give motor supply to the skeletal muscles and sensory supply to the mucosa. So this is the pharyngeal arch, number one. Number two, this is another figure taken from Langman. This is the section is, this is a coronal section, and here lie দুই দিকেই আছে, গলার দুই দিকে. This is the floor of the mouth, and here is the first pharyngeal arch, second pharyngeal arch, third pharyngeal, fourth, and here lie the fifth nine. So each pharyngeal arch has its own nerve. Look here, it's a blue color. Has its own cartilaginous component, has its own blood vessels, has its own muscular component. কারণ মাসল থাকলেই নার্ভ থাকতে হবে। কেন? মাসলকে সাপ্লাই দিতে হবে নার্ভকে, নার্ভ will have to supply the muscle, that is the motor supply. So each pharyngeal, like first pharyngeal arch এর নার্ভটা হচ্ছে mandibular division of trigeminal nerve here. So look at the nerve. The first pharyngeal arch, the nerve of the first pharyngeal arch is, look here, mandibular division of trigeminal nerve, fifth cranial nerve. The nerve of the second pharyngeal arch is the facial nerve. The nerve of the third pharyngeal arch is the glossopharyngeal nerve. The nerve of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch is the vagus nerve, 10th cranial nerve, vagus nerve. So you have to remember, তাহলে ফার্স্ট ফ্যারিঞ্জিয়াল এখন এই নার্ভটা কাকে সাপ্লাই দেবে? কার্টিলেজকে? না, আমরা মেইনলি উই আস্ক যে এখানে যে স্কেলিটাল মাসলস হবে এখান থেকে মেসোডার্ম থেকে, সো দ্য স্কেলিটাল মাসলস আর সাপ্লাইড বাই দিস নার্ভ, দ্যাট ইজ দ্য মোটর সাপ্লাই. সো ফার্স্ট ফ্যারিঞ্জিয়াল আর্চের নার্ভ হচ্ছে ম্যান্ডিবুলার ডিভিশন অফ ট্রাইজেমিনাল নার্ভ, সেকেন্ড ফ্যারিঞ্জিয়াল আর্চে facial nerve, third pharyngeal arch glossopharyngeal nerve, fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch the vagus nerve. Now derivatives of pharyngeal arch cartilages I have already told you. Again I'm just running. So here the mandible derivatives of so mandible is formed by intramembranous ossification. So we will ask you what it just I'm going outside from here. We will ask you what is ossification. এখান থেকে বেরোয় আমি একটু কথা বলছি. What is ossification? Ossification means the process of formation of bone. I will be staying in the hard part of your prof exam, inshallah, if everything goes on fine. I expect and I hope that you will appear in your prof exam regularly, inshallah. So if the exam occur, I will sit on in the hard part. So I will ask you, what is ossification? Answer ta ki hobe, madam? This is the process of formation of bone. Then I will ask you, what are the types of ossification? Answer ki hobe, madam? Intramembranous and intracartilaginous. Then I will ask you, what is the difference? The answer should be, madam, intramembranous bone will be deposited in a membrane. Age theke ekta membrane thakbe, sekhane bone. And what is intracartilaginous? There will be a cartilaginous model, hyaline model, cartilaginous model, and over that bone will be formed. Age ekta cartilaginous model hobe, সেটার উপরে bone তৈরি হবে. That is intracartilaginous. আর membrane এর উপরে bone হবে, bone deposition হবে, সেটা হবে intramembranous. Then I will ask you, give some example of bones which are intramembranous in ossification. তাহলে answer, all the bones of the vault of the cranium. Vault of the cranium, not cranium. Vault of the cranium. The flat bones of the vault of the cranium. Intramembranous. তারপর নিচে নামি, the mandible, the clavicle. This is the answer, intramembranous. তো উপর থেকে নিচে, vault of the cranium, mandible, clavicle, and all other bones are intracartilaginous in ossification. আচ্ছা, that is এটা আমি যেটা বললাম সেটা আমার it is out of my today's topic. Now, the mandible is formed by intramembranous ossification, and how there is a cartilage which is known as Meckel's cartilage here. So here, a cartilage of the mandibular arch. The name is Meckel's. Meckel is the name of the scientist. So here is the cartilage is known as the Meckel's cartilage, and the body of the mandible, not the ramus, not the coronoid process. The body is formed by intramembranous ossification around a cartilage. The cartilage is known as Meckel's cartilage, which is a derivative of mandibular arch, again, which is a derivative of first pharyngeal arch. Meckel's cartilage acts as a template for development of the mandible, but does not contribute directly to it acts as a template around which bone forms. Occasionally, ossification, the second arch cartilage may extend from the styloid process and stylohyoid ligament. And derivatives of pharyngeal arch muscles. What are the muscles which are derived from pharyngeal? So, up to this, we have seen that what are the bones which are derived from the pharyngeal arches, because I told you the pharyngeal arches contain mesenchyme or mesoderm. তো আমি বলেছি যে মেসোডার্ম থেকে সব বোনস আসে মোস্টলি, and I told you মেসোডার্ম থেকে সব মাসলস আসে মোস্টলি. There are exceptions, few. So initially I talked about the number of pharyngeal arches, and I told that every pharyngeal arch has a cartilaginous component which give rise to the bones, which bones I have already finished, and I have also shown you the figure. Now, what are the muscles which comes from the pharyngeal arch? দেখি একটু, এটা দরকার নাই, too much হয়ে যাচ্ছে. Okay, pharyngeal arches. So these are the muscles. আমার মনে হয় আমি এটা আরেকটা ক্লাস নিব. Skeletal muscles are supplied by, so muscles of the first pharyngeal arch. Sketch of the head and neck region of a 20-week fetus dissected to show the skeletal muscles here. আচ্ছা, এটা এখন আর বলবো না. Now, each arch is supplied by its own cranial nerve. You know it, and I have already shown you this picture, and I have already, from the pharyngeal arches contribute to the dermis and mucous membrane. That is দরকার নাই. don't have to remember this. This is about the supply of our face. You have gone through it. So you don't need this. So we have completed the derivatives of pharyngeal arch. We have completed only the bones. In next class, I will discuss about the muscles. These are the classes which will be taken for the senior students, not you. So up to this, you remember that what are the bones derived from the pharyngeal arches. So the bones, I'm again repeating, the bones which are derived from the pharyngeal arch are these. Kiki bone তা আমরা আবার একটু বলে যাই. The first pharyngeal arch has a maxillary prominence and has a mandibular prominence. The maxillary prominence will give rise to maxilla, zygomatic bone, and squamous part of temporal bone. The mandibular prominence will give rise to there will be a cartilage which is known as Meckel's cartilage, and around here the body of the mandible will be formed by intramembranous ossification, and this is from first pharyngeal arch, mandibular prominence of the first pharyngeal arch. Also, there are 3 small bony ossicles inside our ear, middle ear cavity, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The malleus and the incus will be derived from the cartilage of first pharyngeal arch. Now, come here about the second pharyngeal arch, the bone formed from the second pharyngeal arch. The other name of the second pharyngeal arch is the hyoid arch, and the other name of the first pharyngeal arch is the mandibular arch. So the bones of the hyoid arch of the second pharyngeal arch is the upper part of the body of the hyoid bone, lesser part of the hyoid bone. Now, this ligament is important, stylohyoid ligament, from styloid process of the temporal bone to the hyoid bone. This ligament, the styloid process of the temporal bone, also the stapes. The third arch gives rise to lower part of the body of the hyoid bone and the greater horn of the hyoid bone. And the cartilages of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch will give rise to the bones of the larynx except epiglottis. So this much you know. And also I told you that each arch has a muscular component, and each muscular component has a nerve, and the nerves are, each arch has a muscular component, and each arch has a specific nerve. The nerves are the nerve of the mandibular arch is the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. The nerve of the second pharyngeal arch is the facial nerve or seventh cranial nerve. The nerve of the third pharyngeal arch is the glossopharyngeal nerve or the ninth cranial nerve. Nerve of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch is the 10th cranial nerve or the vagus nerve. So mandibular trigeminal nerve, I don't know you have gone through this. This is the trigeminal ganglia, the 5th cranial nerve. It has 3 division: ophthalmic division, maxillary division, and mandibular division. So the trigeminal nerve, this is the 5th cranial nerve. It has 3 division. That is why trigeminal, tri means 3. Ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division. This ophthalmic and maxillary division give rise only to sensory supply, no motor supply. The mandibular division is mixed, that is, it has sensory and motor supply. The motor supply is given to the muscles of the mandibular arch, the skeletal muscles of the first pharyngeal arch. ওখানেই supply দিচ্ছে mandibular division of the second pharyngeal arch. 7th cranial nerve দিচ্ছে second pharyngeal arch. 9th cranial nerve is giving supply to this third pharyngeal arch. 4th and 6th, because I told you 5th arch disappear, is supplied by the vagus nerve. These are all motor supply. So this much you remember. And in next class, I will go to the muscular component of the pharyngeal arches, then the pharyngeal cleft and the pharyngeal pouches. So this much today, okay? We finish it here. Okay. Thank you. Next class. Next Tuesday.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am. Assalamualaikum, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Assalamualaikum, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.